Alright, so I'm going to be reviewing a book today called Into the Wild. Into the Wild, now if I'm remembering right, and some literary person can correct me, Into the Wild was also a book by Jack London. And this is a newer book. It's a biography about a young man named Christopher McCandless. And it was made into a movie a few years ago. I watched the movie about a week ago, and there's a plane going by. I'll have to forgive that. The movie, I'd wanted to watch it. I remember back when it came out, and I never did. Because I've been touched by the book back in 2006, 2007 when I think I'd listened to it on tape actually, and I'd wanted to listen to it or watch the movie when it came out, but I didn't. And then I had the thought of that movie about a week ago, and I thought I'm gonna watch that, and I watched it, and it felt kind of like a connection for me. It was something that I had spurned a lot of thoughts back when I had watched the book, and when I watched the movie, it brought a few things home for me, and I'd like to share my perspective. Now, before you watch this video, I am going to talk about how it ends. So this is more for people who have seen the movie, and I think it may help you to give you some perspective that might help you to take maybe a little something more out of it than what you got. So if you haven't seen it yet, go watch it, but then come back. So Christopher McCandless was raised in an upper middle class home. Goes away to college, spends 4 years there, gets his degree, graduates, and then promptly takes his life savings, which amount to about $24,000, which he was going to spend going away to graduate school, and gives it to charity. And he hits the road and leaves. He and doesn't tell his parents or his family where he's going, and he just disappears. And within a short time, I think within the first few weeks, he abandons his car. He burns his Social Security card and his driver's license and all of his identification. A short time after that, he burns all of his money, and he just hits the road. For a period of time, he hitchhikes. He ends up having a number of adventures. I'm trying to think of the first place he went. I'm missing a piece of it, but after his first adventure, he kayaks. He finds a kayak somewhere, and he kayaks down the Colorado River and goes through a spillway, underneath a spillway, into Mexico, tramps across upper Mexico, and ends up coming back across the border. Of course, he has no identification, and but he's obviously from the United States, and they let him back in. He ends up meeting a couple hippies, spends some time with them. He makes his way out to California, spends some time with a fellow. Before he goes to California, he goes to South Dakota for a time, works for a fellow who runs a grain elevator. Then he makes his way back out to California. he spends some time with another fellow out there. Um, well, he was in California twice. I'm trying to think. He spends some time in Slab City, which is a place where basically people just are squatting, and there's just people from all over the place. But if you're watching this, the likelihood is you've watched the movie or you've read the book. And so I think the last place he stays is with the fellow who does leather work and stuff like that, and he makes himself a belt. And but he keeps dreaming about going to Alaska, and eventually he goes. And I can't remember how he gets up there. I can't remember if he hitchhikes all the way up or what. But he does work a couple of jobs along the way. Of course, he has no identification, so he has to work for people who will, pay him under the table, because he decided he did need a little bit of money after he burned his money. And he ends up in Alaska and has quite an adventure there. Almost starves, and then finally ends up, lives on what he has a .22 rifle, and he shoots small animals, and he eventually shoots a moose, and he can't get it smoked fast enough, and it rots, and he ends up mistaking a certain type of plant for another type of plant, and he's the kind that's poisonous, and it almost kills him, and then he's so weak within a short time he dies. I've seen mixed reviews with regards to this book. Some people say that he was crazy. Many say he was foolhardy. Some people say he's my hero. And eventually, I think he's found about 2 weeks after he dies, and the body is identified, and his parents find out, and his sister find out that he's died. Now, I want to keep this movie, this under 12 minutes. Now, the last time I tried to do that, it took me half an hour. So I'll try to make it quick. I just want to put out a couple thoughts. The movie and the book really impacted me, and they hit me at kind of pivotal times. I think part of the reason that it hit me is that in some ways, I'm like Christopher McCandless. I was raised by somebody who's kind of a conspiracy theorist, my father, and I remember him talking about how it was unconstitutional that we have social security numbers and everything like that, and talk of the Federal Reserve and how it's also unconstitutional and things like this. And for Christopher McCandless, he desired to get away from all of that, to get away from society. He wanted nothing to do with the structures and systems that surround us. And for many, they would probably ask, well, why would he want to do that? And I think because of my upbringing, I think I understand it. And I think because of my own path, I understand it to some extent. Although I've come to realize that I guess see it from a different perspective. Way back when I listened to the book on tape, I had the thought at the time that Christopher had been foolhardy, and that I didn't think he knew what he was looking for, and I didn't think he was going to find what he was looking for. And it turns out that that's the case. When he gets out into the wilds of Alaska, he realizes, and I remember it was so discouraging for me. He realizes at the very end, after spending all this time alone, and when he finally ends up totally alone in Alaska, and he's going to die alone, and he's realizing that he might die. And there's this one point where I was really upset because he kept a journal, and he ends up when he's in a weakened state. He ends up realizing, I think he reads something by Tolstoy. He was really into reading a lot of the classics, and he read something by Tolstoy about how Tolstoy kind of lived a similar life, and did a similar thing to Christopher McCandless, and Tolstoy says he realized something to the effect of that that the real joy of life was sitting around with a group of family and friends, and reading. I can't remember what he said. Reading a good book, or sitting around the campfire and telling or sitting around the fireplace and telling stories. And I can't remember what all he said, but something that he talked about how real happiness happened with people. And it's like, and there's this moment in the book where he realizes this, and he decides to go home. And he realizes that he's found what he was looking for. And I remember at that point, it was like, it was kind of this catharsis in the book, I remember. And of course, it's a true story, so it's like it can't end the way you want it to. And he realizes this, and I'm thinking to myself, it's really worth it, because he's had the adventure, he's had the experience, and now he's headed home, and he packs up and he's headed home, and he starts trekking back the way he came, and he comes to this little river, what had been a little river, this little stream, when he had hiked in. And it's now this massive river with rapids and everything, and he can't get across. And he accidentally falls in. He tries, and he falls in, and he realizes that he's trapped. And it's pretty disturbing. I remember when I read the book, I remember just being devastated by the fact that he can't get back home. And so he goes back, and to his bus. There's this old bus out there in the middle of nowhere. I don't know how it got there, but that's where he's been staying, is in this bus. So he goes back. And long story short, it's after that he has his worst mishaps, and he ends up dying. In the very end, he'd been going by the name of Christopher Supertramp or something Supertramp, and he changed his name and to this silly name that exemplified his journey. And he decides, that he wants to go by his real name. And at this point near the end, where it's looking like he's going to die. It's like he really realizes that for the last time that he has a place in society, and that he wants his friends, the people that he loves, maybe even his family. And at this point that he does, it's really interesting because it really brings up some big questions. Now, all through his journey, what you end up discovering is that he'd had a pretty troubled growing up. His parents fought constantly, um, and he ended up finding out later in life, or later in his teenagehood, that when his parents met, his father had been married, um, and they had Christopher before his father was divorced, that he had a brother that he didn't know about from his father's first marriage. And from that time forward, he'd really considered that his whole existence was a fraud, because he came from this this marriage that had come out of deceit, and so it felt like his whole life was a lie. And I can relate to that. In any case, he came to this place where, he decides that that he wants family, and then he promptly dies. And he owns his own name, and it's interesting because, and this is the point I wanted to bring it to, really, and this is the perspective that I wanted to kind of shine on the story. The fascinating thing to me is that it seems to me that he had to have the journey to come to that realization. And that it was important for him to leave. And what I wonder is that, it's like the person that he believed himself to be was not the person that he was. He believed his life to be a fraud, but he discovered that his life wasn't a fraud. He wanted to leave the trappings of society, the trappings of the systems, which we're forced to buy into. And strangely, in a way, he was right. When you wake up, when your consciousness wakes up in the little body of an infant, and then you're raised, and you end up discovering that, that the system into which you're born is, that there's something flawed in it. You kind of have two choices. You can pretend that there's nothing wrong, which is kind of what his father did. Pretend that nothing was wrong when something was deeply wrong. Well, not just with the Federal Reserve or the system that we live in now, but just with his own life. You can pretend like nothing's wrong. And you can enmesh yourself into it. But that is not a benign choice. That's not a choice that is going to make yourself or the world that you live in any better. In fact, for sure, it will make the world and yourself worse. Or you can do what Christopher McCandless did, which is you insist upon a journey into the wilderness. That doesn't mean you have to burn your Social Security card. And, if you do, there's a good chance you might, find the same fate. But in many ways, I can't find fault with the journey he chose. It was the journey he chose. But I think he found in the long run that that it was something else that he was seeking for. And what I really wonder, if you guys who've seen the movie and you're sharing this perspective with me, is I wonder if, the real journey that Christopher took was a journey into the wilderness of his own soul. And strangely, when we decide to make that journey, it often starts with making some sort of a change which somebody will find fault with. There usually comes to be a certain particular thing that you just can't do anymore. Wherein you say, and so often it's something that doesn't make sense. And that's what happened for Christopher McCandless. And what it did in some ways is it thrust him into the wilderness, and it really thrust his parents and his sister into the wilderness too. They had no choice. Their hearts and their minds followed after their brother and their son. And what you see from the book and the movie is that it has a real changing effect upon his parents and upon his sister. They are forced to go with him. Not that he intended that. He didn't intend that. He just had to make a choice for himself. He just knew that he couldn't go on with the way things were. And you see it bringing his parents together in many ways, and you see things happening with his sister. And for that reason, and maybe this is where I'll leave it. People have debated who've seen the movie. Well, did Christopher, was it brave and amazing, or was it foolhardy, stupid, etc.? For that reason, I almost feel like it was worth it. You'll say, well, how is it worth it when he lost his life in the attempt? Well, it all depends on what life you're talking about. If our perspective is that what we're trying to find in this life is worldly success, fulfillment, and a long life, well, then it was a complete and utter failure. But if what we're seeking in this life, if we are more than just mortals, if there's more than just this life, then it seems to me that it was worth it. Because Christopher found something out there alone in the wilds of Alaska, and on the road through California, South Dakota, Mexico, in all his wanderings, he found something. And his parents found something. And his sister found something. And I can't help but believe that they were different. That whenever, those who remained, whenever their lives were over, that they carried something with them out of this life. And I think if Christopher had decided to just end his life, to just take a gun to his head or take some pills or something. That would have been one thing. I don't think he would have gained much. But he hadn't intended on doing that. I mean, he might have been foolhardy, but he wasn't suicidal. And that doesn't mean that a person doesn't learn something who goes through an attempted suicide or a suicide, that they may not come to something out of it in the long run. In the short run, I think it's not going to bring the soul to a better place. But I think in this instance, in the instance of Christopher McCandless, that his soul was expanded through the experience, and that the souls of his family were expanded. And that whenever a person makes a choice not to just settle in and do what society tells them to do, but to follow a light that shines for them, the light that leads into the wilderness of their own soul, that assuming that they're able to, that what they're after is really, that they are after a truth of the soul. I can't help but believe that whether they live or die in their excursion, that they'll find it. If their hearts are honest, they'll find it. So, wanted to give a little review of that book and movie. And just say wherever you all happen to be out, if it was just a movie, then it's just a movie. If any of you happen to find yourself in your own wilderness, the wilderness of your own soul, if some light is shown and led you out, if you find yourself on the outside in some way, if you felt that you can't just do what everyone else has done because something's wrong with it. And if a light has led you into a place wherein you find yourself estranged from friends or family, well then, even though we may not have meant to be here, you and I are together, and our paths may appear different. But we're on the same journey. And this channel, if you've come here, is about the trackless path. And I hope to share, as you remain here, insights that will help you to traverse this wilderness of the soul. And though I can't tell you what to do with your specific life, I wonder if I might be able to help share some insight that will keep us all alive, and that we can come out on the other side more alive than we went into the wilderness. More alive coming out than we were when we went in. God bless you. Next video, I'm going to try to shorten it. I don't know that any of you have the stamina to stick out a half an hour, so I'm going to have to make my little reviews of things more like 15 minutes at the most.